Imagine sitting in a cafe, enjoying your coffee, when suddenly a stranger insults you in front of everyone. Most people explode in anger, but what this man did instead left the entire cafe in shock. And trust me, you'll want to hear this story till the very end. Welcome to Brainfuel, where we share powerful stories that inspire, motivate, and remind us of the strength of humanity. If you believe in respect, kindness, and standing up for what's right, then hit that subscribe button and join our family. Because together, we spread stories that make the world a better place. Do you even belong here? The voice cut through the warm hum of chatter like a knife. Cups froze halfway to lips. Keyboards stopped clicking, and spoons clinked against saucers as every head in the cafe turned toward the corner where the insult had landed. It was supposed to be just another quiet afternoon. The sun streamed through the tall glass windows, painting golden patches across the polished wooden floor. The cafe buzzed with its usual life. Students hunched over laptops, workers tapping away on keyboards, and friends laughing softly over steaming mugs of coffee. The scent of roasted beans hung heavy in the air, mingling with the sweetness of fresh pastries. At one small corner table sat David, a young black man in his late 20s. He was dressed simply, dark jeans, a crisp button-down shirt, and a well-worn backpack at his side. His posture was relaxed, shoulders slightly slouched as he sipped from a ceramic cup and flipped through the pages of a book. To him, this cafe wasn't anything special. It was just a comfortable spot where he could read, think, and breathe after a long morning at work. But to one woman seated at the next table, his very presence seemed like an intrusion. She was in her early 40s. Her hair neatly styled, a designer bag resting proudly on the chair beside her. Every movement she made carried an air of superiority. From the way she stirred her latte to the way she glanced at others, as if silently judging whether they belonged. When her eyes landed on David, something shifted in her expression. Her lips tightened, her brows furrowed, and her gaze lingered just a little too long. Then came the words, "Do you even belong here?" The cafe froze. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. A young couple at the window leaned closer to hear better, their eyes wide. A student paused his typing, his headphones slipping off his curiosity pulled him into the moment. Even the barista behind the counter, who had been busy steaming milk, slowed to a stop, her hand frozen on the pitcher. For a split second, David didn't move. He turned one more page in his book, as if he hadn't heard. But inside, his heart gave a small, heavy thump. He had heard those words before, different places, different voices, but the same sting every time. They carried more than sound. They carried judgment, exclusion, and centuries of prejudice packed into a single sentence. The woman leaned forward, her tone dripping with disdain. "I asked you a question. People like you don't usually sit in cafes like this. So what are you doing here?" Her words weren't whispered. They were loud, sharp, meant to be heard. And they were. Every single person in the cafe now had their eyes on David, waiting. The room was thick with tension. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, wanted to look away but unable to. Others stared openly, hungry to see what would happen. A young man near the counter muttered under his breath, "This is about to get ugly." David finally lifted his eyes from the book. They were calm, steady, but not without weight. He studied her for a moment, his silence speaking louder than words. He took another sip of coffee, then set the cup gently back on the saucer, the porcelain clicking softly against wood. The woman mistook his quietness for weakness. Her voice rose, sharper now. "Well, I'm waiting. Do you have any idea where you are? This is a respectable place, not somewhere for just anyone." Gasps rippled through the cafe. A teenager at a corner table covered her mouth with her hands, whispering something to her friend. A man in a business suit frowned and shook his head, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to step in. And still, David sat there. His face betrayed no anger, no frustration, just a quiet strength, a patience that seemed to unnerve the woman even more. The silence stretched long enough to feel heavy. The only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft hiss of the espresso machine in the background. Everyone was waiting for a confrontation, for raised voices, for something explosive. But David wasn't going to give them that. He had learned long ago that reacting in anger often gave more power to people like her. People who thrived on pushing others down, who wanted to see a rise so they could say, "See, I was right about them." Instead, he kept his composure. He leaned back slightly, folded his hands on the table, and finally spoke in a voice so steady it cut through the tension like a calm breeze. "Do I belong here?" he repeated softly. "That's an interesting question." The woman tilted her head, smirking as if she had cornered him. "Well, do you?" David gave a small smile, not arrogant, not sarcastic, just a smile that hinted at something deeper. "Ma'am, I'm here for the same reason everyone else is. A cup of coffee, a quiet moment, a little peace. I believe that's something we all deserve, isn't it?" A few people in the cafe exchanged glances, nodding almost imperceptibly. The tension loosened slightly, but the woman wasn't ready to back down. She opened her mouth to fire back, but something about the way David spoke, the calmness, the dignity, seemed to stall her words. And in that moment, the atmosphere in the cafe shifted. What had begun as a scene of judgment and hostility was slowly becoming something else, a silent battle between ignorance and dignity, prejudice and patience. The crowd leaned in, their curiosity growing. They wanted to see what David would do next. Would he stay calm? Would he finally snap? No one knew. But one thing was certain. The story that had just begun was not one anyone in that cafe would forget. The cafe was still buzzing from the first confrontation, whispers running like a current through the room. People leaned over their cups, pretending to sip while secretly hanging on to every word. Everyone thought the situation might settle now that David had spoken calmly. But the woman wasn't finished. Her eyes narrowed, lips tightening as if she refused to let the silence be her defeat. She leaned across her small round table, her bracelets clinking against the polished wood, and sneered, "Don't play smart with me. People like you don't just sit quietly in places like this. You're up to something. I can feel it." The words were louder this time, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. A barista dropped a spoon behind the counter with a clatter, startled by the sharpness of her tone. David tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but steady. He didn't respond right away, and his silence seemed to provoke her even more. She crossed her arms, her chin lifting in defiance. "You probably don't even have a real job," she said bitterly. "People like me, we work hard. We earn the right to enjoy places like this. But you're probably living off handouts, wasting everyone's time. Honestly, you should be somewhere else." Gasps rippled through the cafe. A student sitting nearby muttered, "That's messed up." A middle-aged woman clutched her coffee cup a little tighter, her face pale with discomfort. Still, no one spoke up. They were afraid of getting involved, afraid of making things worse. So they sat, watched, and waited. David finally lifted his gaze, his calm brown eyes meeting hers. His voice was low, almost soft, but it carried an unmistakable strength. "Excuse me." The woman leaned back in her chair with a mocking laugh. "Oh, don't act innocent now. You heard me. You don't belong here. This cafe isn't for people like you. It's for decent people, educated people, hard-working people." Her words struck like stones, each one harsher than the last. But David's face didn't flinch. He had heard versions of this before, in classrooms, in workplaces, in stores. The same poison poured into different bottles, but still it stung. He closed his book slowly, sliding into the center of the table as if marking a pause. Then he leaned forward, resting his hands on the wood. His calmness unsettled her. She expected anger, fire, something she could use against him. Instead, she was met with stillness. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "I don't think you know me well enough to make those kind of judgments." "Oh, I know enough," she snapped, her voice rising. "I can tell by looking at you. Don't think you can fool me with that little act of yours. People like you don't contribute anything to society. You're just here to take advantage of others' hard work." Whispers grew louder in the cafe now, as if the crowd couldn't contain themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief. A young woman near the window whispered, "Why doesn't someone stop her?" A man with glasses muttered, "This is crossing the line." But still, no one stepped forward. David sat back in his chair and let out a slow breath. His calmness was not because he didn't feel anything. It was because he felt everything, but he refused to let her dictate the way he responded. Finally, he spoke again, his words deliberate and clear. "Ma'am, you don't know what I do. You don't know what I've worked for. And you don't know the struggles I've faced to sit in this chair today. But I can tell you this. I belong here just as much as you do." The woman's face flushed with anger, her eyes blazing. "How dare you talk back to me? You think you're equal to me? Don't make me laugh." The cafe grew even quieter. You could almost hear hearts beating. The tension was that thick. The barista behind the counter bit her lip, clearly torn between stepping in and staying out of it. David didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't rise to her level of hostility. He simply kept a steady gaze on her, his calm voice slicing through the storm. "Yes," he said softly, "I am equal to you. And the sooner you understand that, the better the world will be." The cafe seemed to exhale all at once. Some people nodded. Others murmured in agreement. A man near the door clapped once before catching himself, realizing the moment wasn't over. But the woman only grew angrier. Her hand shook slightly as she gripped the edge of her table. Her pride wouldn't let her back down. "You don't deserve to sit here," she spat. "You'll never belong in places like this. People like me, people who matter, built this world. You're just living in it." The cruelty of her words stung the air like smoke. But David didn't waver. He leaned forward, his voice even calmer than before. "Ma'am, if you really believe that belonging comes from skin color or from sitting at a certain table, then maybe you don't understand what truly matters. Belonging comes from respect, from kindness, from humanity. And that's something we should all share, no matter who we are." The cafe erupted in hushed murmurs again. This time, there were more nods, more whispers of agreement. People were starting to see not just a conflict, but a lesson unfolding before their eyes. The woman, however, was unmoved. She crossed her arms tighter, her voice bitter. "Respect? Don't talk to me about respect. You haven't earned mine." David gave a small smile, almost sad. Respect isn't something you earn by tearing others down. It's something you give freely because it shows who you are, not who the other person is. The weight of his words lingered in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a moment, even the woman seemed speechless. But everyone in that cafe knew one thing for certain. This confrontation was far from over. The cafe felt like it was holding its breath. Even the hiss of steaming milk from the espresso machine had gone silent, as though the cafe itself was listening. The woman's words hung heavy in the air. "You haven't earned my respect." Everyone expected David to snap now, to raise his voice, to push back with the same anger that was being poured on him. That's what usually happened in confrontations like this. Fire met with fire. But David didn't. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He took a slow sip of his coffee, set the cup gently back on the saucer, and reached into his bag. The woman's eyes narrowed suspiciously, and a few people in the cafe shifted nervously, unsure of what he was about to do. From the bag, David pulled out a sleek, silver laptop. He opened it, the glow of the screen lighting his calm face. Then he looked directly at the woman and spoke, his tone quiet but unshakably firm. "Ma'am," he began, "you've made a mistake. Not only do I belong here, but I've worked hard for everything I have in my life, just like you claim you do." The woman scoffed, crossing her arms tightly. "Oh, please, don't pretend. People like you." But David raised a hand, not rudely, but with the calm authority of someone who had something important to say. The interruption was gentle, yet commanding enough to silence her. "You asked what I do," he continued. "Let me answer you. I'm a software engineer. I design programs that are used in hospitals across this country, programs that monitor patients, track their treatments, and, in many cases, help save lives." There was a collective intake of breath in the cafe. A man sitting with his daughter at the window leaned forward, his eyebrows raised. A student at the corner table whispered, "Wait, seriously?" David nodded, closing his laptop halfway as though to punctuate his point. His eyes didn't leave the woman's. "I spend my days solving problems most people don't even know exist. "The cafe Wi-Fi you're using right now." He gestured lightly toward her phone resting on the table. "My company built part of the system. That makes it possible. The world you live in, the technology you depend on, it's built by people like me. People who you just told don't belong here." A silence heavier than before swept across the room. The woman's smug expression faltered for the first time. Her mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came out. Still, her pride was strong. She shook her head, her voice sharper now, desperate to regain control. "That doesn't change anything. You think a fancy job makes you equal to me? It doesn't. You'll never belong here with decent people." Some in the cafe shifted uncomfortably at her words, but this time there was also a change in the crowd. A man near the counter whispered, "That's disgusting," while a young woman muttered, "She's unbelievable." David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, even compassionate. He had learned long ago that anger only fueled people like her. So, instead, he chose something stronger. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, "sometimes it's not the coffee shop that's too small for someone. It's their heart." The words landed like a stone thrown into still water, rippling across the cafe. People blinked, sat up straighter, and let the meaning sink in. For the first time, someone clapped softly, almost involuntarily. A young man at the corner table let out a low whistle of admiration. Even the barista, who had been frozen in hesitation, smiled faintly behind the counter. The woman's face burned red. Her jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. She tried to form a comeback, but the calm dignity in David's words had left her speechless. Every insult she had thrown now seemed childish in comparison. But David didn't gloat. He didn't smirk or look triumphant. He simply reopened his laptop and continued, as if the exchange had been nothing more than a minor interruption in his day. And yet, the cafe was buzzing. Whispered conversation sprang up around the room. "Did you hear that?" someone said. He completely shut her down without even raising his voice. That was powerful. The barista, perhaps emboldened by the energy in the room, walked over with a fresh cup of coffee and placed it in front of David. "On the house," she said softly, for making today better than it started." David gave her a polite smile and a quiet thank you before turning his attention to his book. Meanwhile, the woman sat frozen, her pride cracking under the weight of what had just happened. The power she thought she held over him had slipped away, not because he fought her with anger, but because he chose grace. And grace, when wielded with strength, was far more disarming than fury. Around the cafe, people were learning something they hadn't expected to learn that day. They came in for coffee, for laptops, for conversations with friends, but they had witnessed something bigger. They had seen how a person can defend themselves without shouting, how dignity can silence hate, and how sometimes the calmest voice in the room is the loudest one of all. David's reaction hadn't just surprised the woman. It had shocked everyone, and it was only the beginning of what the day would teach them. For a moment, silence blanketed the cafe. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. The woman sat stiff, her face red with anger, but her words had dried up. David had calmly disarmed her insults, and though she sat there fuming, the battle of dignity versus hate felt one-sided. But then, from the other side of the cafe, a chair scraped across the floor. All eyes turned as an elderly man, perhaps in his 70s, rose slowly to his feet. His hands trembled slightly as he rested them on the cane he carried, but his voice, when he spoke, was steady and clear. "Young man," the old man said, his finger pointing gently at David, "I want to thank you." The cafe fell into stunned silence once again. No one expected anyone to get involved, especially not an elderly customer who had been sitting quietly near the window. Even the woman blinked in surprise, momentarily distracted from her anger. David looked up from his book, slightly startled, his eyebrows furrowed. "Sir," the man's voice wavered with emotion as he spoke. "You said you create software for hospitals. Is that true?" David gave a small nod. "Yes. My team develops programs that help doctors monitor patients' conditions in real time." The man took a shaky breath and gripped his cane tighter. "Then I owe you more than I can ever repay." My wife is in the hospital right now. She's been battling a heart condition for years. Just this morning, her doctors used a program to track her heart rhythm, something that alerted them before things got worse. They told me it gave them time to act quickly. Gasps spread across the cafe. Customers turned to look at the man, their faces softening with empathy. A young woman near the counter pressed a hand to her chest, whispering, "Oh my God!" The old man's eyes welled with tears as he continued. "If that's the kind of work you do, then you're one of the reasons my wife is still alive today. You belong here. No, you belong everywhere. And don't let anyone, not even someone like her, make you believe otherwise." The cafe erupted into murmurs of agreement. Some people nodded. Others wiped their eyes. The barista behind the counter clutched her apron, visibly moved. David blinked, taken aback. He hadn't expected his work to be recognized, let alone praised so publicly. He stood, his tall frame towering respectfully over the frail man. Slowly, he extended his hand. The old man grasped it firmly, despite the slight tremor in his grip. Tears streamed down his face now, but his smile was full of gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking, "for what you do and for reminding us what true dignity looks like." The moment was electric. Applause broke out. First hesitant, then growing louder as more people joined in. Some clapped softly, others cheered. A group of students near the back even whistled. It wasn't the kind of applause you hear at performance. It was raw, spontaneous, and filled with admiration. The woman who had started it all sat frozen, her face pale now instead of red. She looked around, realizing the entire cafe had turned against her. The power she thought she had evaporated, replaced with humiliation. One woman at a nearby table leaned toward her and said firmly, "You should be ashamed." Another customer muttered, "Unbelievable, in this day and age." The rude woman's lips pressed into a thin line. She grabbed her expensive handbag, yanked it from the chair, and stood abruptly, without saying a word. She stormed out of the cafe, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. The door slammed shut behind her. The sound seemed to mark the end of something ugly and the beginning of something beautiful. Inside the cafe, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Smiles replaced frowns. Strangers who had been silent before now exchanged looks of solidarity. A man in a business suit leaned toward David and said, "You handle that better than anyone I've ever seen." The barista walked over again, this time carrying a tray with a fresh pastry. She placed it on David's table with a warm smile. "This is for you," she said. "Not because you needed to prove anything, but because you reminded us all of what really matters." David chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You didn't have to." "We wanted to," the barista said, glancing at the other customers who were still clapping. Meanwhile, the elderly man slowly sat back down, exhaustion clear on his face but relief glowing in his eyes. David walked over to him, crouched slightly, and spoke quietly so only he could hear. "Sir, I hope your wife recovers soon. I'm grateful my work could make even a small difference." The man patted David's hand with his weathered palm. "You've made a difference far greater than small, son. Today, you saved more than my wife. You saved this room from forgetting what compassion and respect look like." Those words sank deep into everyone who overheard them. The cafe, once tense with division, was now filled with unity. People looked around at one another, reminded that kindness, empathy, and dignity were stronger than any prejudice. David returned to his seat, reopened his book, and sipped from his fresh cup of coffee. To him, the moment was over. He wasn't seeking applause, nor was he interested in victory. He simply wanted peace. But for everyone else in the cafe, the moment was far from ordinary. It was unforgettable. The day had started like any other. Coffee, laptops, conversations, routine. But it had turned into a story they would carry with them, a story they would retell to friends and family. The day they saw a man silence hate with dignity and witness an entire room stand behind him. And though the rude woman was gone, her absence left behind something she could never have predicted, a stronger sense of community. A lesson that respect is not determined by skin color, wealth, or pride, but by humanity itself. When the door shut behind the rude woman, the sound seemed to echo in the cafe. For a few moments, no one spoke. The tension that had once felt so heavy was gone, replaced with something lighter, something almost sacred. It was as though everyone in the cafe had just witnessed a storm pass, leaving the air clearer than before. David sat back down, opened his book again, and quietly turned a page. To him, it was over. He hadn't come here to fight, and he hadn't come here to prove himself to anyone. He had simply wanted a cup of coffee and some peace. But to everyone else, what they had just seen was unforgettable. A group of college students at the back table leaned toward each other, whispering excitedly. "Did you see how calm he stayed?" one said. "I would have lost it." He didn't even raise his voice. Another shook her head in disbelief. "That's the kind of strength you can't fake. That's real dignity." Near the counter, a mother with her teenage daughter gave David a warm smile. The daughter whispered, "Mom, he was amazing. I want to be like that, strong but kind." The mother nodded, her eyes shining with pride at the lesson her daughter had just absorbed without a single lecture. The elderly man who had spoken up earlier was still sitting quietly, his hands folded over his cane, a small smile tugging at his lips. For him, it wasn't just about the cafe or the insult. It was about knowing there were still people in the world who chose grace over anger, compassion over hate. The barista, still shaken but inspired, began working with new energy. Each order she called out was met with smiles from customers who, just minutes ago, had been strangers too wrapped up in their own worlds to notice one another. Now, the room felt united, as though a thread of humanity had been woven through every person there. And at the center of it all was David. Though he didn't seek attention, he had become the quiet teacher of a powerful lesson. His calm response had shown that true strength doesn't come from the loudest voice in the room, but from the one that refuses to be dragged into the darkness of hate. One man in a business suit, who had been silent through the entire ordeal, finally stood and walked over to David's table. He hesitated, then extended his hand. "I just wanted to say, thank you. You reminded me today that character speaks louder than status or wealth." I needed that reminder. David shook his hand politely, offering only a nod and a smile. "We all need reminders sometimes," he said softly. The man walked back to his table, but his posture was different now, more thoughtful, less rigid. The cafe had become more than just a place to grab coffee. It had become a classroom, a theater, a sacred space where people had seen something extraordinary unfold. And though the incident had started with cruelty, it ended with clarity. The measure of a person is not in the insults they receive, but in how they rise above them. David turned another page in his book, but he could feel the warmth of the room around him. The people weren't just going back to their lives unchanged. They were leaving with a story they would retell, a memory that would shape the way they saw others. Some would go home and tell their families about the man who answered hate with grace. Some would tell their co-workers the next day. Others would simply carry the moment silently, a seed planted in their hearts, ready to grow when the world tested their patience and humanity. The elderly man eventually rose to leave, leaning heavily on his cane. As he passed David's table, he paused. "Son," he said quietly, "you reminded me of something I used to tell my students long ago. Respect is not a gift, it's a responsibility. And today you live that truth." David smiled, humbled by the words. "Thank you, sir. I just did what I felt was right." The man patted his shoulder and walked out into the afternoon sun. Soon, others began to leave too, but the atmosphere remained changed. Where before there had been a room full of strangers, there was now a room full of witnesses. Witnesses to the power of dignity. For the rest of the day, that cafe would be different. Conversations were softer, kinder. Smiles were easier to find. Even the barista noticed more people leaving tips, more people saying thank you with genuine warmth. And though David eventually packed up his things and left, the memory of him stayed behind. It lingered in the wooden tables, the smell of roasted coffee beans, the very air itself. Because what everyone had realized in that cafe was something simple yet profound. Respect isn't earned by the color of your skin, the money in your wallet, or the clothes you wear. Belonging isn't defined by the places you sit or the drinks you order. True belonging comes from the humanity you show, the kindness you give, and the dignity you carry. David had shown that day that sometimes the strongest voice is not the one that shouts, but the one that stays steady. And sometimes the biggest shock isn't an angry outburst. It's a calm, dignified answer that leaves hate with nowhere to go. The people left the cafe with full cups and fuller hearts. They didn't just carry their lattes and pastries. They carried a story they would never forget. And at the center of that story was a man who reminded them that the most powerful reaction to hate is not anger, but dignity. That day, David didn't just finish his coffee. He left behind a legacy.